Welcome on into the Fantasy Football Forge. My name's Steve, and today we will be looking at, I don't know what I've titled this video yet, because I think my running backs video, tight end, and I'm not doing quarterbacks for these, videos are going to be called targets. But because of this list and the amount of risk that is involved with all these players really on this list, it's more of a values list, I would call it. Guys who I think could be a value at their ADP. But ultimately, it's whatever. It's 10 wide receivers who I think are maybe going a little bit too low compared to their ADP, who I definitely have ranked higher. So these are going to be top 60 players via ADP. Or my rankings, there's one player that's outside of one of those top 60. That'll be right at the top of the list because he's in my top 60, outside of the ADP top 60. And we're going to go in order of the biggest differences that I have. And I can tell you, after prepping for this video, that I am going to be going through, and I'll talk about it with these players, which players I'm talking about here. I will be going through and doing some changes to my rankings, and that's one of the things that's really great about doing this kind of exercise is I have to find the argument to back up my ranking, or find the argument to, well, basically, yeah, I have to find the argument to back up my rankings. So I think, if you like this stuff, hey, rankings, there's a link in the description to my rankings. That link, that website will be there all off season for you to see the most recent updates as I update them. At the bottom of each ranking list, I have the most recent. You can see when it was updated. I usually remember to update that portion of it. So we're going to start this list off with not that player. I have tricked you. This player here over there is Roman Wilson, my 55th ranked player currently, ADP 97th wide receiver off the board, not player, my 55th ranked wide receiver. He is a second-year player who basically missed all of last season due to injury. I understand why he is off the radar for most. This is a projection, but it's based on previous thoughts and the situation. And just to go off on a little bit of a tangent here, first of all, what we are doing at this time of the year is trying to project. We can't just take what they did last year, what they did 2 years ago and last year, whatever, and say, well, that's exactly what's going to happen going into the future. We know these things vary widely from season to season within the NFL for fantasy football purposes. And so that's why we project. A little bit of a tangent is that when you go and you look at the ECR rankings, there is a bit of a flaw with their grading system, and everybody that's entering that, they want that to be able to be titled, as a top 10 projector for positions, for the overall projections, etc. But the system that they have, the scoring system that they have, really incentivizes people to not get too bold with their projections, especially, or the rankings at this time of the year, especially when it comes to higher up rankings, because it gives you the most points for the number one wide receiver that you have ranked, if you're correct on that, or how close that you were on that. So once again, it does not incentivize people to go out on a limb and to say what they truly feel on situations. It really incentivizes them to start to normalize their rankings along with the average rankings of the entire group, because being off by too much at different points, yes, it can reward you, but it also can hurt your rankings to a detrimental way. So just a little bit of an issue that I have with those. But going back to Roman Wilson and talking about the situation that he's in, that did just get muddier in Pittsburgh with the addition of Jonnu Smith. That's why I actually did move Roman Wilson even further down in my rankings. Yeah, I had him even higher originally, but I do still think that Roman Wilson is going to be the wide receiver 2 on this team, and thus still get on the field plenty. Personally, I think that Roman Wilson has the skill set to be the next Amon-Ra St. Brown. If you took Garrett Wilson and Amon-Ra St. Brown and you made a baby, I think that you essentially get Roman Wilson. I'm not saying he's going to be better than either of them, have the same stats as either one of them, different situation, all that good stuff, and of course, still very, very unproven. Potential is one thing, actual results and play is another thing. But other comps out there too for him, which of course comps sometimes get lofty, but Tyler Lockett, JSN, funnily enough, both from Seattle, are other comps that if you go and look out for comps for him. All of these guys are a type of skill set that can soak up targets on an offense, and that is really beneficial for fantasy football teams. How many targets will there actually be to soak up in this Pittsburgh offense this year is another question, which is not lost on me in this argument, which is part of why I have him as low as I do, despite the fact that I'm much higher on him than consensus. At the end of the day, when it comes time to pick the last wide receiver on my bench in fantasy football, if nothing has changed 2 months from now, I think that a guy like Roman Wilson could prove to be a fantasy gift and a mainstay in my flex spot. One parting analogy as to why I don't want to ignore this potential like so many people are at this point of the offseason at the very least, is that one of the top contenders this is an example here, if one of the top contenders in the Daytona 500 were to get wrecked by someone else, totally out of their power, there was no way that they could have prevented getting wrecked within, let's just say, the first 10 laps of the Daytona 500. Would you then completely write that driver off as a contender for the next year's Daytona 500? I don't think that you would. Roman Wilson did not get on the field because of a talent issue. The reason that he didn't get out there was because he got injured right out of the gate, and the moment later on in the season when he did get healthy, he got re-injured pretty much immediately again. That happens sometimes. Roman Wilson is your best value in this draft, I think, and you can take him at the very end of your draft currently. He is not going drafted, at least in most league formats and league sizes. That's going to bring us on to my 35th ranked player in Jack Bech. He is currently going as the 68th wide receiver off the board, which pretty much puts him on the borderline of is he even getting drafted or not. Here's another one where we are we taking a risk? Yes, we are. But over the past decade, a little bit less than that technically, I think, we have seen plenty of day one and day two rookie wide receivers come in and have an impact year one, not only for their team, but for fantasy purposes as well. Jack was taken 58th overall in the draft this year, putting him smack dab in the center of that data range right there in round 2. One of the pieces to early success for a wide receiver in fantasy football is for them to come into a role more often, that role being the primary receiver on a team. That's going to go a long ways. Jack Bech is that in my book. I was really impressed with him when I scouted him for the draft. I don't think that Jacoby Myers prevents him from becoming the wide receiver one, assuming that he does develop into that, of course. To me, Jack Bech has true wide receiver potential. He's been on an absolute tear since graduating college, impressing with literally every opportunity that he's had to get on the field this spring leading up to the draft, and that's part of why he did get drafted where he got drafted. Jack is the first of several rookies on this list, and for that matter, we could just throw Roman Wilson right into this conversation. I don't want you to hear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that you should go out and take a risk on every one of the guys that I have in this video. What I am saying is that they have a chance to be really good values because of the unknown factor, and you should be willing to take a chance on one or two of them depending on how your draft goes, especially for where you can get them in the draft, because this consistently happens with these types of rookie wide receivers, unproven talents. Once again, understandably so, I get it, but it can really, really pay off to take the risks on these guys. That's going to bring us on to wide receiver 31 in my rankings, average draft position going at wide receiver 60. That guy over there, that is Marquise Brown, and he's part of the reason why I didn't put a title at the top of the video, because he would have just covered it, and that would have looked, I think, more sloppy than just not having a title at the top of this video. I'm going to take a guy who was targeted 25% of the routes that he ran by Patrick Mahomes after coming back from an injury that caused him to miss almost the entire season. I'm not saying that his stats were ultra impressive late season and into the playoffs, this is another potential-based projection. As you will see, they basically all are in this video. But we are talking about a very talented player who should be coming into his prime, who has Andy Reid as the head coach of his team and Patrick Mahomes throwing to him. And as we already established, Patrick Mahomes is willing to throw the ball to him for sure. I'm almost certainly being too optimistic at wide receiver 31. I'm probably going to be lowering that a little ways. Like I said at the top of this video, I am going to be going back and redoing some of my rankings based on just this exercise of making this video. But at wide receiver 60, he is barely being drafted, if being drafted at all in leagues. And once again, he's definitely going to be on my short list of late wide receivers that I'd be willing to take a flyer on. And that's going to bring us on to my wide receiver 36 in my rankings, Jayden Higgins, average drafted player 54. So he probably pretty solidly is getting taken at the end of drafts at least. And if you're not familiar, I was one of the bigger fans at the very least, of Jayden Higgins leading into the draft this last offseason, this offseason. I think that he is absolutely spectacular. He was my number 2 wide receiver in this draft class. Going 34th overall validated my thoughts on that talent that he is. I think the path to becoming the number 2 receiver on the Texans it's fairly clear what that path is, but it is also far from a sure thing. He's going to have to live up to that wide receiver player 34 taken in the draft. He's going to have to live up to my my scouting report on him, essentially. But this we're going to go into some drawbacks here. This is an offense that is going to want to establish and then continue to run the ball all game, and that could limit overall receiving opportunities for sure. And they do have a good defense who should complement that want to do that for the offense. So there is some concern there for, once again, just overall the amount of times that they're going to be throwing per game compared to other teams. There is, of course, a major target getter as well, already on this offense, very established, not going anywhere, in Nico Collins. The slot wide receiver position is also pretty full of talent. Christian Kirk himself is no slouch, and then they also went out and drafted fairly highly in this draft another receiver who some people thought had like borderline wide receiver 1 potential in Jalen Noel. He went basically where I thought he should go, but he's also, a contender to be competing for targets, to be competing to get on the field in certain formations, etc. And as far as Tank Dell goes, we probably don't have to be too concerned about that this year. It's not expected that he'll be returning from his injury, and if it is, it's going to be so late in the season or into the playoffs, something like that. Is this another instance where maybe my ranking is a little too high, a little too close to this player's ceiling, especially for an unproven talent? Probably. That's been a great part of doing this exercise for me. I'm going to be able to fix some errors where maybe I got a little too high up on some guys. Nonetheless, he's another late draft target that could pay off as a high-end flex player who I believe in, who, once again, with the final portion of this video, we're going to go into these wide receiver 30 and beyond group, where at that point, especially in final season production, we're really taking shots on guys looking for upside, looking for guys who can be the wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2 target, or the receiver 2 target on their offenses. But that is going to bring us on to the next player here. My 44th ranked player is Tre Harris, average draft position going 59, starting to get a little bit closer, closing in that gap. I think that he's in a fantastic situation to have a big rookie season. The path to being the number 2 receiver on this roster is definitely more clear than it is for Jayden Higgins. He's another wide receiver that I was quite high on this offseason. Very high on, and being taken mid-second round validated my scouting report on him as well. And as I prepared for this section of the video, wrote up my stuff on him, I was thinking to myself, I might be too low on Tre Harris, especially in comparison to some of these other guys who I have higher. He was drafted higher than Jack Bech after all in this draft, though the target situation for him, to me, is not as clear as it is for Jack Bech, and the difference in draft was 45th to 48th, was it, right? Something like that. It was a 3-pick difference between the two in the draft. The path to being the clear number 2 wide receiver for Tre Harris, however, is more clear than it is for Jayden Higgins. Guys, I'm telling you, this is a great opportunity for a truly talented, true X-receiver kind of talent. He's also got the better quarterback situation than either Bech or Higgins does. He's going to be going up my rankings to some extent, as well as those other two possibly coming down, but honestly, I might end up with Tre Harris above both of them, which sounds a little bit crazy, but also, when you think about it, it's not that crazy. That's going to bring us on to wide receiver Chris Olave, my 22nd ranked wide receiver currently in my rankings. Average draft position for wide receivers, 35th overall. And my immediate reaction to this is, oh boy, not again. Because if you were not with us last offseason here on this channel, I was high on Chris Olave, unapologetically so. Even before his injury, that was not going so well for me. I've taken the bet on clear-cut target shares on bad offenses before, and it's worked out more often than not. What I mean by that is players who have literally no, they're a talent, but they have no competition elsewhere on the roster for the receivers. However, they're on a bad offense and or have a bad quarterback. Usually those two go hand in hand. And so, or an unknown quarterback. And so, because of that, they go lower in drafts than the potential is for them. We tend to overly pull down people for those reasons. And I think that is happening to Chris Olave. Of course, you have the added concern for a lot of people with his concussions as well on top of that, which is probably why he's being pushed down even more. But those bets have worked out more often than not for me. Olave has no competitions for targets in this offense, and now that Clint Kubiak is gone, thank God for him, I think, they won't be running this weird offense where players like MVS and Rashid Shaheed were getting targeted even more than the best wide receiver on their team in Chris Olave. It's like they were using him as a decoy for some odd reason. The touchdown upside, admittedly, yeah, he's the quarterback situation, the team overall. It is limited, I should say, the offense overall. But he should get targeted very heavily, and I'm going to be happy to take a shot on that type of player yet again in this draft, especially if I can get him as a back-end flex wide receiver 4 practically. That being said, the moment that I draft him, if it happens, probably will, given where he's going currently, I'm going to be nervous. There's going to be a little bit of a pit in my stomach that's going to say, you got yourself into this again. How's it going to end up? Until that week 1 where he just goes off for me and I'm like, yeah. That's to bring us on to my 32nd ranked wide receiver. That is Khalil Shakir. He's going 42nd on average among wide receivers, and I totally understand this ADP. But you're getting Khalil Shakir at his floor at or after especially wide receiver 42. Last year, he finished between wide receiver 36 and wide receiver 41. 41 via the average fantasy points per week, and 36 via my consistency rankings, which I'll just quick plug. My consistency rankings have consistently proven to be more a predictor of which player is going to help you to win more games along the season. Shakir himself, he had 100 targets in 2024 on the dot, and he had the 12th highest target rate of all qualifying wide receivers, of course, that's always how this works, at 28.3%. So, why did he finish so low in fantasy football compared to his amigos? Because he had a really low amount of touchdowns. He only had 4 total touchdowns. That was at a rate of 5.1%, 49th among qualifying wide receivers. He was second in the league for yak, so that's a benefit. He is definitely one of those full PPR guys, low ADOT, high yak. So, once again, value him more if you're in full PPR. Value him where I'm telling you to value him roughly in half PPR, and value him less in standard, because standard, he's really going to have to improve with those touchdowns. It's going to be really important for his production there. I expect him to improve upon those 4 touchdowns in one of the highest powered offenses in the league. And that's what could boost him into definitely, possibly high-end, probably high-end flex territory. But also, with a little bit of luck, you really turn those touchdown totals around, and he could even be back-end wide receiver 2 territory. Plus, he's consistent, and I always like guys that I know have a high floor. That's why I made those consistency rankings of mine on a week-in and week-out basis. He's reliable, with upside, based on statistical regression, especially given the offense that he's on. A lot of reasons to think he could have a better fantasy season in my book. That's going to bring us on to My third ranked receiver in A.J. Brown, average draft position going wide receiver 10. Brown finished last year between the wide receiver 6 and the wide receiver 12. So why do I have him all the way at wide receiver 3? This is another example of a guy who was incredibly reliable week in and week out. That wide receiver 6 finish is my consistency rankings, whereas the wide receiver 12 finish was his average fantasy points per week finish. Could I push him down a few spots in my rankings? Of course I could. There's a lot of great talent in those top 10-ish wide receivers. But I know exactly what I'm getting with A.J. Brown. This offense has not had any changes that should impact that. If anything, they'll have to pass more often than they did last season, because asking Saquon Barkley to take on the same workload that he did last year and be as effective as he was, that's an incredibly tall task to ask of him, and probably not even a smart one if you want Barkley to make it through the entirety of the season without getting injured yet again. I think that he has a better offense and a better quarterback than these names that are currently going ahead of him via ADP. Those names are Drake London, Brian Thomas Jr., Malik Neighbors, CeeDee Lamb, Justin Jefferson, and probably Nico Collins as well. That does not mean that you have to draft A.J. Brown over all of those guys, or even any of them. But, generally speaking, I do prefer guys who are on better offenses and have better quarterbacks. I think that they have more potential. Once again, generally speaking, there's obviously more factors that go into this whole thing, but I think if you're getting A.J. Brown as a 10th wide receiver off the board, that's fantastic. And if you take him higher than that, I'm definitely not going to make fun of you for that. That's going to go on to our last wide receiver in this video. That is Calvin Ridley over there. He is currently ranked 27th in my rankings. Average draft position, 34th. So, as you can see, we've gotten pretty close now into the difference between my ranking and their average draft position. I've been the one telling you to avoid Calvin Ridley for the past 2 seasons based on how highly he was getting drafted. That's always how these things work. Everything in fantasy football, in terms of analysis of targets, avoids, sleepers, do drafts, don't drafts, whatever, that comes down to where they're getting drafted. It doesn't come down to I like this player. I like, every player, basically. I mean, I don't know these people. I don't care who they are. I'm trying to win a fantasy football league, okay? I want to get the guys who are going to score the most fantasy football points for me, consistently, preferably, throughout the entirety of the season. So, my issue with Calvin Ridley has been how highly he's been getting drafted. Now, I'm on the other side of that fence. It feels weird, and I fully admit that once again, as this list has lended itself to, there's definitely risk involved if you're taking him up at wide receiver 27, where I have him ranked, or higher. I could easily be wrong on this. I could be wrong about any of these guys in this video. I probably won't be wrong about all of them. I almost certainly will be wrong about at least one of them. That could be Calvin Ridley for sure. Ridley finished at or just outside of the top 40 wide receivers in fantasy football last year. Half PPR scoring is all my stuff. That's the baseline that we're working from. But he's still the clear-cut number 1 target in this offense. They haven't gotten anybody to really threaten those targets, in my opinion. An offense that took the number 1 quarterback of the draft, Cam Ward. I expect things to be better for Ridley under Cam Ward than last season. How much better will they be is an absolutely fantastic question. That wouldn't we all just love to know the answer to, but we just don't have crystal balls. I will not be targeting Ridley, and that's especially an appointment statement if I do end up labeling this video targets or something like that. But I may end up with him if he is falling to or below that ADP of wide receiver 34, depending on my roster construction at that point in the draft. The path to a top 24 finish among wide receivers for Calvin Ridley is not extremely far-fetched. Going back to my unwillingness to outright target Calvin Ridley, looking at my current rankings, he is quite literally the first wide receiver in a tier where the outcomes among a large group of other wide receivers has a lot of volatility. Wide receivers in the range where we've been talking about a lot of those guys in this video. And that's why I'm willing to take some risks on these types of guys at this point in the draft. And of course, ultimately, what I'm getting at is that the difference at the end of the season between most of them will be relatively inconsequential to how your team actually preferred in terms of the win-loss category. Each year, once you get to around wide receiver 30, all the way down to around wide receiver 50, you're splitting hairs. And before I went back and I looked at the 2024 season to validate, give you a little bit of data to back up that claim, I want to make clear that I did not just come up with that number out of my butt. That is a number that's stuck in my head from some analysis that I've done throughout the off seasons based on previous seasons' outcomes and looking for kind of what the tiers are generally within each position of players. There's a big, long document on each position on the website. If you really want to go search for it and find it, it's there. But season long, their average fantasy points per week will be a difference of about 2 fantasy points from the wide receiver 30 down to the wide receiver 50. That's among 20 wide receivers. The difference between the top of that tier and the bottom of that tier be 2 fantasy points. And a week in and week out basis, that itself is not going to be what determined when you won or when you lost. The specific receiver that you grabbed within that group could be anywhere, and they might have resulted with, giving you more wins, even if they finish the season with 1 point less on average per week. So when we look at last year's results, we go to last year's wide receiver 31, DJ Moore, who averaged 2.1 fantasy points per week more than the wide receiver 47. You'll never guess who that wide receiver is. That's Allen Lazard. That's all the difference was between DJ Moore and Allen Lazard. I don't know if that means that we appreciate what Allen Lazard did or overappreciate what DJ Moore might have done. And for those who drafted DJ Moore, you actually probably aren't so surprised by this, but maybe you're surprised by the Allen Lazard part at the very least. Nonetheless, you look at that same 2.1 fantasy points per week difference among groups of wide receivers. When you go from wide receiver 47 to 66, about 20 wide receivers there, same point difference. This grouping was about 15, 31 through 47, 15 to 20-ish. Same point difference. Obviously, when you go from wide receiver 15 up to wide receiver 31, DJ Moore, a 2.1 fantasy point per week difference. That's going to be about 15 wide receivers there. When you look at wide receivers 5 through 15, just a group of like 10 wide receivers, same point difference of 2.1 wide receivers, of 2.1 fantasy points per week. When you look at wide receivers 2 through 5 finished last year, average fantasy points per week, the difference between that group is only 1 point. And when you look at the difference between the number 1 wide receiver to the number 2 wide receiver, the average fantasy point difference per week was 4. Just to show, those higher up wide receivers, those top 15 wide receivers are much, much more valuable than the number 15, 16 wide receiver is compared to whoever has the number 30 wide receiver. Just like the difference from your number 30-ish wide receiver at the end of the season isn't going to really have a huge impact on how many games you won or not compared to the wide receiver 60. It more so depends on which weeks those wide receivers had good weeks and the opponent that you faced that week. So there you go. That's it for the wide receiver video. I hope you guys liked it, of course, but let me know what you agree with, disagree with. Always on board to hear other people's feedback. This is a community exercise. Ultimately, no single one of us will be right on everything, knows everything, and sometimes we have heard knowledge from others or have looked up our own knowledge that we have that somebody else might not have heard. So that's what you do, is you pass it along as part of the fantasy community. You just don't give that information to your teammates if you liked it. All right. League mates, I should say. There we go, guys. Peace out. I'll see you in the next video. I think I'm going to release this. Then we're going to do running backs. And then I have one video for the tight end targets and you're drafting them 2 highs. Fades. Bye-bye.